of the Guild of St. George. It is lovely to see so many of you here this evening. I'm Rachel Dickinson, as Simon has said, and I'm the current Master of the Guild of St. George. In case anybody here is not aware of who we are as an organization, the Guild was established by John Ruskin in the 1870s, in fact, about 151 years ago, and we are now an educational charity for arts, crafts, the rural economy, and indeed for a range of things that Ruskin was passionate about, which includes Venice. This is the fourth and final session, as Simon has mentioned, of kind of reading group and dialogue. Each session has been led by two individual voices responding to the notion of voices from Venice. And today I'm delighted to introduce two guides to take us on this journey, two people who I've known for many years, Sarah Quill and Emma Sdegno. They are both companions of the Guild of St. George, and both are joining us live from Venice. Sarah Quill has worked for many years between Venice and London to create an extensive photographic archive of Venetian architecture, sculpture, and daily life. Sarah is quite remarkable in her ability to trace Ruskin's eye in Venice, and there is such a skill and art in her ability to photograph this. Her book, Ruskin's Venice, The Stones Revisited, was published in 2000, followed by a new extended edition in 2015. This has recently been translated into Italian for those of us joining today who speak Italian. And in 2004 to 2007, she worked as the Venice consultant on Lancaster University's research project for the digital edition of Ruskin's 1849 to 50 Venetian notebooks. She lectures regularly, principally on Venetian subjects, and is a trustee of the Venice in Peril Fund, the British Committee for the Preservation of Venice. Emma Sdegno is Associate Professor of English Literature and Culture at Foscari University, Venice. She has written several essays on Ruskin with a focus on rhetoric and religion, and in the context of translation and travel studies, and is interested in the relationship between Ruskin and Venetian institutions. Her recent publications include the Italian translation of John Ruskin's Guide to the Principal Pictures in the Academy of Fine Arts at Venice, edited by Paul Tucker in 2014, and Looking at Tintoretto with John Ruskin, also in Italian and French, and presented at the Ducal Palace in Venice in 2018. She has organized a number of international conferences in Venice. Most recently, in 2019, she co-organized a Ruskin Bicentenary Conference, Ruskin's Europe. If you would like to read more, the proceedings are available as a free download, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a moment. In addition to being a companion of the Guild of St. George, she is a Consorella of the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice. So in a moment, I will hand over to Emma and Sarah, who will share with us a PowerPoint presentation of images along with their readings and dialogue. That will last, as Simon has said, for about 45 minutes, and then there will be time for just a couple of brief questions before ending at 6:30. The chat function will be open throughout, so do feel free to write comments and questions there. And so with that, Emma and Sarah, thank you, welcome, and over to you.
Many thanks to Rachel. Oh, sorry. No. Sorry. So sorry, I had many thanks to Rachel for her very kind introduction, and also for having read online some passages of Fors Clavigera with the Guild's companions early last year. Of Ruskin's latest works, Fors is among the most challenging ones, for the wealth of matters it raises and the form in which it does it. Issues rise, swell, merge, dissolve into one another, and resurface through the letters like sea waves. In a way, Fors Clavigera epitomizes Ruskin's work as a whole, wide and unbound like the sea. And the sea has a central part in Ruskin's imagery as the generative, life-giving element, and it has a special relation to the city of Venice, as we shall see. Of Fors Clavigera, this puzzling work, I shall point out a few aspects that will be relevant to our reading today. The first is that Ruskin wrote this epistolary work from 1871 to December 1884. 1871 is a dramatically important date for Europe. In July 1870, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. It was the first major international conflict to take place in Europe during Ruskin's lifetime, and it opened, as he predicted, a 70-year struggle. The very first lines of Ruskin's first letter, dated January 1871, refer to it as the, I quote, direct calamities which have befallen on neighboring states, and denounce Britain's doctrine of non-intervention. Ruskin was much interested in foreign questions, as Cook and Wedderburn remind us, and, we can add, he felt strongly attached to Europe ever since he was a child, traveling to the continent with his parents. And this is a map he drew at 10 years old, one of the several he drew. And he felt part of a European cultural community to the very end of his life. Ruskin's visions were European visions, as Dennis Cosgrove has extensively argued. In The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, written in 1884, he looked back to the Franco-Prussian conflict, recalling how, I'm quoting, that war was especially horrible to me, in its digging, as the Germans should have known, a moat flooded with the waters of death for a century to come. In these very days, in which a tragic war has broken out in the heart of Europe, we particularly feel and share Ruskin's surfacing sense of devastation and threat. Fors Clavigera was explicitly addressed to the workmen and labourers of Great Britain and aimed to comment on what was going on abroad as well as in the UK in all sorts of fields, and show how and what contemporary facts did mean and affect his country fellows' lives. Fors Clavigera is written in the form of letters, the form that more than any other implies a contact with the reader. It tends to establish communication. In its experimental mode, Fors Clavigera recalls partly St. Paul's letters and partly today's blog. Ruskin started writing them monthly and then got more erratic. He wrote the letters from home as well as from abroad, from the various places he stayed during his journeys. From Paris we have one letter, one from Beauvais, two from Rome, one from Pisa and Lucca, one from Florence, one from Verona, and 9 letters from Venice. The bunch from Venice is the most conspicuous by far, and was written in the years 1876 and 1877. He wrote mainly on the city's shattered conditions and its artists, mainly his beloved Carpaccio. This was a particularly hard time in Ruskin's life. Rose Latouche, the young woman he had loved desperately, died in 1875, and the following year he got involved in the campaign against the restoration of St. Mark's Basilica that Clive Wilmer and Peter Berman have told us about in depth in the first Voices from Venice session. The letter we are reading today is the last of this Venetian series. It has the bitter and sad tone that the historical and personal events had left on him, and still it is inspired by Ruskin's own strenuous ethical sense, urging him to pass on a legacy that he saw as more than ever vitally important to people. In the letter, Ruskin focuses on the Ducal Palace, a building he had written on 26 years before in The Stones of Venice, Volume 2, Chapter 8.
At the beginning of Ruskin's letter of May 1877 from Fors Clavigera, his thoughts have returned to the southwest angle of the Ducal Palace, called always by him the fig tree angle, and described in detail in the Stones of Venice. The 14th century corner capital represents the planets of the zodiac and the creation of man, with the great figure sculptures of Adam and Eve and the serpent and the Archangel St. Michael above them. These sculptures held a deep significance for Ruskin. Since early childhood, he'd been steeped in the literature of the Paradise myth, beginning with daily Bible readings with his mother, followed by Milton's Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Dante's Inferno. The narrative of Adam and Eve's expulsion from paradise, their journey through divine retribution, travail, and eventual redemption, ending in judgment, and finally the revelation of an eternal city, was central to Ruskin's thinking and his understanding of the world. In May 1877, he wrote to his readers of Fors Clavigera, Letter 78, Venice, 9th of May, 1877. The Sword of Michael. I send today to our museum a photograph of another capital of the Ducal Palace, the chief of all its capitals, a cornerstone of it, on which rests the great angle seen in your photograph. Looking carefully, you will easily trace some of the details of this sculpture, even in that larger general view, for this new photograph shows the same side of the Capitol. Representing this white figure nearest us, Luna, the moon, or more properly, the angel of the moon, holding her symbol, the crescent, in one hand, and the zodiacal sign Cancer, the crab, in the other. She herself in her crescent boat floating on the tides, that being her chief influence on Venice. And note here the difference between heraldic and pictorial symbolism. She holds her small crescent for heraldic bearing to show you who she is. Once that is understood, her crescent boat is a picturesque symbol of the way her reflected light glides and traverses and trembles on the waves. You see also how her thin dress is all in waves, and the water ripples under her boat so gaily that it sets all the leaf below rippling too. And above these, the Archangel Michael, with his name written on the cornice above him, Archangel Michael, the Archangel being written towards the Piazzetta and Michael larger towards the sea. His robe is clasped by a brooch in the form of a rose, with a small cross in its center. He holds a straight sword of real bronze in his right hand, and on the scroll in his left hand is written, Ense bonos tego malorum crimina purgo. With my sword, I guard the good and purge the crimes of the evil. Purge, not punish. So much of purgatorial doctrine being engraved on this chief angle of the great council chamber of the Senate. End of quotation. Well, not far from St. Michael, on the west facade of the palace, is a tondo labeled Venezia, which you see here on the right. She too holds a sword, and she personifies Venice as justice. She is flanked by two lions to indicate the justice and the wisdom of Solomon, and her scroll states, enthroned, strong and just, I vanquish by sea the furies beneath my feet. And at her feet are the waves of the sea and two vanquished furies. Wisdom, justice, and peace were Venice's primary civic virtues, with justice being the most highly valued. The promise of salvation was embodied in the complex of church and state, San Marco and the Ducal Palace. Peace and religion were united with justice and wisdom. If justice was the highest virtue of the state, with peace as its consequence, then the virtue of those who governed was wisdom.
Purge, not punish. This is a key issue for Ruskin. It has to do with justice and mercy. His discourse reverts to a series of questions on social justice in Fors Clavigera. I read from Fors. To guard the good is no business of Venice now. It is not one man as good as another, and as to angelic interference, must not everyone take care of himself? To purify the evil, but what? Are the days of religious persecution returned then? And for the old story of Adam and Eve, don't we know better than that? Questions are a strong feature of this letter, as well as the majority of Ruskin's late works. Questions have an eternal and universal validity and status, while answers are contingent and relative. Questions are not. They interrogate on issues that men keep asking themselves throughout the centuries. And Ruskin's questions resonate in our ears as they did in his contemporaries. They are seldom merely rhetorical. They provoke and force his readers to leave their comfort zone and feel uncomfortable, ethically and socially uncomfortable. This seems to be the sense of the question Ruskin asks his Sheffield readers. I'm quoting from the letter. Why haven't you a ducal palace of your own, without need to have the beauties of one far away explained to you? Bills enough you have, stuck in variously decorative situations, public buildings also, but do you take any pleasure in them? And are you never the least ashamed that what little good there may be in them, every poor flourish of their cast iron, every bead moulding on a shop front, is borrowed from Greece or Venice, and that if you got all your best brains in Sheffield and best hands to work with that sole object, you couldn't carve such another capital as this? Ruskin is saying here that the old city of Venice had nurtured and brought up its own citizens through art, whereas the citizens of Sheffield were exploited in their work and deprived of their sense of beauty. Why don't you have a ducal palace in Sheffield points at something missing in the overproductive British town. In ancient Venice, Ruskin thinks, buildings were at the service of people, done by them and for them, and used to speak to them. There was a tight mutual relationship between people and their buildings. This is why there is no point of bringing home some portion of architecture from abroad. They are speechless, this is what he says. In order to understand what the Ducal Palace represented for Ruskin and for the Venetians of old, we must go back to the Stones of Venice, Volume 2. And I read from the Stones. The Ducal Palace, which was the great work of Venice, was built successively in the three styles. There was a Byzantine ducal palace, a Gothic ducal palace, and a Renaissance ducal palace. The second superseded the first totally. A few stones of it, if indeed so much, are all that is left. But the third superseded the second in part only, and the existing building is formed by the union of the two. We shall review the history of each in succession. First, the Byzantine Palace. In the year of the death of Charlemagne, 813, the history of the Ducal Palace begins with the birth of Venice, and to what remains of it at this day it is entrusted the last representation of her power. In the first year, therefore, of the 14th century, the Gothic Ducal Palace of Venice was begun, and as the Byzantine Palace was in its foundation coeval with that of the state, so the Gothic Palace was in its foundation coeval with that of the aristocratic power. Considered as the principal representation of the Venetian school of architecture, the Ducal Palace is the Parthenon of Venice. I wish the reader to remember the date 1301 as marking the commencement of a great architectural epoch, in which took place the first appliance of the energy of the aristocratic power and of the Gothic style to the works of the Ducal Palace. The operations then began were continued with hardly any interruption during the whole period of the prosperity of Venice. And yet, with all this Venetian magnificence, what was engraved in the stones of the Palazzo Ducale was not the statement of its magniloquence and pride, says Ruskin, but of humbleness, the confession of its own weakness. And I continue reading from the stones. The reader remembers, I trust, that most characteristic sentiment of all we traced in the working of the Gothic heart was the frank confession of its own weakness, while the principal element in the Renaissance spirit is its firm confidence in its own wisdom. Here, then, the two spirits speak for themselves. The first main sculpture of the Gothic palace is on what I have called the angle of the fig tree. Its subject is the fall of man. The second sculpture is on the angle of the vine. Its subject is the drunkenness of Noah. The Renaissance sculpture is on the judgment angle. Its subject is the judgment of Solomon. It is impossible to overstate or to regard with too much admiration the significance of this single fact. It is as if the palace had been built at various epochs and preserved uninjured to this day for the sole purpose of teaching us the difference in the temper of the two schools.
Returning to the fig tree angle, I'll just read part of Ruskin's description of the 18th capital from volume 2 of the Stones of Venice. The 18th capital is the most interesting and beautiful of the palace. It represents the planets and the sun and moon in those divisions of the zodiac known to astrologers as their houses, and perhaps indicates, by the position in which they are placed, the period of the year at which this great cornerstone was laid. Seventh side, the moon in her house Cancer. This sculpture, which is turned towards the Piazzetta, is the most picturesque of the series. The moon is represented as a woman in a boat upon the sea, who raises the crescent in her right hand and with her left draws a crab out of the waves up the boat's side. The moon's drapery ripples down to her feet so as exactly to suggest the trembling of the moonlight on the waves. This beautiful idea is highly characteristic of the thoughtfulness of the early sculptors. 500 men may now be found who could have cut the drapery as such far better, for one who would have disposed its folds with this intention. Well, throughout letter 78 of Fors Clavigera, Ruskin refers to this sculpture of Luna, the moon in her boat, as Leucothea. Leucothea was the Greek sea goddess who came to the aid of sailors in distress. As Ruskin grew older, Greek mythology was becoming as important to him as biblical myth and allegory had been throughout his life. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Leucothea appears in the scene where the Archangel Michael descends to banish Adam and Eve from paradise. And I quote here from Paradise Lost, "Meanwhile, to re-salute the world with sacred light, Leucothea waked, and with fresh dews embalmed the earth, when Adam and first matron Eve had ended now their orisons being their morning prayers. In 1851, when Ruskin feared that the Ducal Palace might not stand for another 50 years, as he wrote to his father, he had commissioned plaster casts of several details from the Ducal Palace capitals, and these were presented by him to the Architectural Museum in London and are now held by the Victoria and Albert Museum. At the time of his 1877 visit, a major restoration of the Ducal Palace was about to begin, and a total of 42 columns and capitals would gradually be moved from the exterior of the building and into storerooms inside for their protection. Those in better condition were restored inside the palace and put back. The most damaged capitals and those that were considered most precious were replaced by identical copies on the exterior. And that group included, of course, the great corner capital, seen here on the right on its original column inside the palace. It was replaced by a good copy on the exterior, and up until 1995, the originals held inside the palace were not on view to the public. Then in that year, 13 of the 14th century capitals from the ground floor level portico were cleaned and consolidated with funds raised by the Venice in Peril Fund. And they are now to be seen inside the Museo dell'Opera of the palace, together with other architectural elements. Except I'm sorry to say that at the moment, the Museo dell'Opera is closed, as I discovered a few days ago, temporarily, of course. By the time Ruskin departed for England in the summer of 1877, he had commissioned more plaster casts for his museum in Sheffield, including this cast of Aristotle from the 17th capital, Men of Wisdom, Art and Science. This capital happens to have a date. On the writing tablet held by the figure of Pythagoras, the date 1344 is carved, which may well indicate the date that the capital was made. Ruskin was convinced of the importance of casts, both for practical study and as accurate records of original works. In his general statement explaining the nature and purposes of St. George's Guild, which he wrote in 1882, he stated that it was possible to convey a perfect idea of the highest qualities of an original sculpture by casts. And he intended that the arrangement of his art gallery in Sheffield would be chiefly designed for the study of sculpture.
Let's go back to Fors Clavigera and read the following passage, paragraphs 10 and 11, where Ruskin asks another series of angry questions. Nothing new, I tell you. How often am I to thrust this in your ears? Is the earth new and its bread? Are the plough and sickle new in men's hands? Are faith and godliness new in their hearts? Are common human charity and courage new? By God's grace lasting yet. One sees in miners' hearts and sailors. Your political cowardice is new, and your public rascality, and your blasphemy, and your equality, and your science of dirt, new in their insolence and rampant infinitude of egotism, not new in one idea or in one possibility of good. And he continues, modern usury is new, and the abolition of usury laws, but the law of force as old as Sinai. Modern divinity with not so much as a lump of gold, but a clot of mud for its God is new, but the theology of force as old as Abraham. And generally, the modern 10 Commandments are new. Thou shalt have any other god but me. Ruskin has definitely the stance of the biblical prophet here, and prophets are not flattering people. Against all virtues, he contrasts new vices. He intended to entitle this letter The 10 Modern Commands of Moses. He saw modern society, financial world and politics, both in Britain and Venice and throughout Europe, obey to the over-imposing laws of profit, which are a reversal of the Mosaic commandments. In the Stones of Venice, he had written minute descriptions of the carved figures of vices and virtues in the capital, which would prove relevant to this topic. And I'll read from the Stones of Venice now. The early Christians felt that virtue, like sin, was a subtle universal thing, entering into every act and thought, appearing outwardly in 10,000 diverse ways, diverse according to the separate framework of every heart in which it dwelt, but one and the same always in its proceeding from the love of God, as sin is one and the same in proceeding from hatred of God. And in their pure, early, and practical piety, they saw that there was no need for codes of morality or systems of metaphysics. Their virtue comprehended everything, entered into everything. It was too vast and too spiritual to be defined, but there was no need of its definition. And when any of the apostles have occasion to describe or enumerate any forms of vice or virtue by name, there is no attempt at system in their words. They use them hurriedly and energetically, heaping the thoughts one upon another, in order, as far as possible, to fill the reader's mind with a sense of the infinity, both of crime and of righteousness. And all early Christians taught in the same manner. They never cared to expound the nature of this or that virtue. Now, exactly in proportion as the Christian religion became less vital, the life of the believer became in some degree separated from the life of Christ, and his virtue, instead of being a stream flowing forth from the throne of God and descending upon the earth, began to be regarded by him as a pyramid upon earth, which he had to build up, step by step, that from the top of it he might reach the heavens. In the capitals of the Ducal Palace, Ruskin sees the equivalent of that hurried and energetical heaping the thoughts one upon another. Vices and virtues were represented through sins and not through abstract concepts, says Ruskin. In this way, the human heart took its multiple facets. It appeared, in his own words, 10,000 diverse ways, to show greed and generosity, chastity and lust, wisdom and pride, and so on. Through art did medieval Venice convey its moral, political, religious values. Neither an embellishment nor a substitute for words, art was but a living symbolical language, and Ruskin asks his readers to draw them or take a picture of them to acquire and grasp the form in which that living thought was shaped. Buildings spoke to the Venetian people in the multi-layered language that merchants, lawyers, wives, husbands, children did know. Its civil, ethical and spiritual values were ingrained in its stones. Thus, the Ducal Palace was both the source and the partner of a dialogue. This is the wonderful insight Ruskin has of the Ducal Palace, to see an ongoing conversation involving the Venetian of old and their stones, as well as the lagoon that faces the palace.
I would like now to read a passage from the first chapter of Volume 2 of the Stones of Venice, the volume entitled The Sea Stories. In this chapter, Ruskin places his reader in the lagoon, and after describing the ebb and flow of the tides, he invites the reader to imagine the sheer solitude and bleakness of the territory that was chosen for habitation by the early Venetians. And a letter from Venice written to his father gives a hint of what is to come. Venice, October the 12th, 1851. I never saw such tides, up and down to all manner of heights at all manner of times. The sea cannot be said to ebb and flow. It shakes up and down. However, I shall have an interesting paragraph about the tides in the first chapter of next volume. For it is curious, rather, that the place where Venice was built was the only place in the world where it could have been built. And here is that paragraph from Volume 2 of The Stones of Venice. They little thought, who first drove the stakes into the sand and strewed the ocean reeds for their rest, that their children were to be the princes of that ocean, and their palaces its pride. And yet, in the great natural laws that rule that sorrowful wilderness, let it be remembered what strange preparation had been made for the things which no human imagination could have foretold, and how the whole existence and fortune of the Venetian nation were anticipated or compelled by the setting of those bars and doors to the rivers and the sea. Had deeper currents divided their islands, hostile navies would again and again have reduced the rising city into servitude. Had stronger surges beaten their shores, all the richness and refinement of the Venetian architecture must have been exchanged for the walls and bulwarks of an ordinary seaport. Had there been no tide, as in other parts of the Mediterranean, the narrow canals of the city would have become noisome, and the marsh in which it was built pestiferous. Had the tide been only a foot or 18 inches higher in its rise, the water access to the doors of the palaces would have been impossible. Even as it is, there is sometimes little difficulty at the ebb in landing without setting foot upon the lower and slippery steps, and the highest tides sometimes enter the courtyards and overflow the entrance halls. 18 inches more of difference between the level of the flood and ebb would have rendered the doorsteps of every palace at low water a treacherous mass of weeds and limpets, and the entire system of water carriage for the higher classes in their easy and daily intercourse must have been done away with. The streets of the city would have been widened, its network of canals filled up, and all the peculiar character of the place and the people destroyed. Well, to accompany those passages, I've shown slides of Ruskin's drawings of the lagoon island of San Giorgio in Alga, called always by him St. George of the Seaweed. Both illustrations were reproduced in the library edition from drawings that he had made in 1849. He would often row out to the island, which he described in a letter of 1859 to his American friend, Charles Eliot Norton. There was only one place in Venice which I never lost the feeling of joy in, at least the pleasure which is better than joy, and that was just halfway between the end of the Giudecca and St. George of the Seaweed at sunset. If you tie your boat to one of the posts there, you can see the Euganians where the sun goes down, and all the Alps, and Venice behind you in the rosy sunlight. There is no other spot so beautiful. And as you see, he did indeed make a watercolor sketch of that particular view shown here, which is now held at the Royal Collection. And in 1877, when disappointment and disillusion had set in, he added a note to the traveller's edition of The Stones of Venice as follows. 1877, From the island itself, now, the nearer view is spoiled by loathsome mud castings and machines. But all is spoiled from what it was. The campanile, good early Gothic, had its top knocked off to get space for an observatory in the siege. Ruskin's referring to the siege of Venice in August 1849, when the Austrians dropped 30-pound bombs on Venice in what amounted, in fact, to the first air raid ever made on a city in order to quell the patriotic uprising led by Daniele Manin. Ruskin and Effie arrived in Venice shortly after the city had surrendered. And Ruskin's drawings were made soon after the Campanile of San Giorgio in Alga had suffered that particular indignity. This 18th century view by Francesco Guardi shows the church with the Campanile intact. All is spoiled from what it was, wrote Ruskin, making clear to his readers the sense of loss that he was feeling in 1877, a quarter of a century after publication of The Stones of Venice. In early November 1851, while researching material for the stones, he had written to his father, "We had a superb high tide this morning, in all over our courtyard and over the greater part of St. Mark's Place, and nothing could be more exquisite than the appearance of the church from the other end, with the reflection of its innumerable pillars, white and dark green and purple, thrown down over the square in bright bars, fading away in confused arrows of colour, with here and there a touch of blue and gold from the mosaics." Well, this letter is interesting because levels of flooding were so much lower in the 19th century, nowhere near the levels that we see nowadays, so that a few inches of high water did not seem to pose any sort of threat. And Ruskin is able simply to appreciate and describe the beauty of the scene. In later years, he would predict several aspects of climate change in his lectures entitled The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, but he could never have foreseen the extent to which rising sea levels would cause such disastrous flooding in Venice in the 20th and 21st centuries. He made a point of studying and noting the tides, and he wrote 3 weeks later to his father, November 23rd, 1851, "I have begun to study the tides carefully, as I found it was hopeless to arrive at any result by mere watching. I have got a tide book, and I'm putting down the hours of turning very carefully." And of course, he could not know then that the sea and the tides, so vitally necessary for Venice to nourish the lagoon and refresh the canals, would also become a century later the city's most implacable enemy.
We are now moving to the conclusion of our presentation. As we have seen throughout our reading, Fors Clavigera invites, even forces the reader to a back and forth movement from Venice to England, from the past to the present. And Ruskin's own past and the historical past blend and meet through classical and biblical symbols, Leucothea, Adam and Eve, the fig tree, etc. Following this back and forth wave-like movement, would like to conclude with the ending of the chapter on the Ducal Palace in the Stones of Venice, which we have extensively quoted tonight, where Ruskin recalls the moment in which he had first really seen the Ducal Palace. It is for him an epiphany. On looking at its sea facade, the one he called the wall of the paradise, it is corresponded to the wall of the Sala Maggior del Maggior Consiglio that hosted Tintoretto's painting that you can see in the slide. On a clear day, when the mountains were visible from afar, Ruskin saw it in all its majesty, a man's work of divine creation overcoming the greatness of the astonishing Alps. I can only say that in the winter of 1851, the paradise of Tintoret was still comparatively uninjured, and that the Camera di Collegio and its antechamber and the Sala dei Pregadi were full of pictures by Veronese and Tintoret that made their walls as precious and so many kingdoms. So precious indeed, and so full of majesty, that sometimes, when walking at evening on the Lido, whence the great chain of the Alps, crested with silver clouds, might be seen rising above the front of the Ducal Palace, I used to feel as much awe in gazing on the building as on the hills, and could believe that God had done a greater work in breathing into the narrowness of dust the mighty spirits by whom its haughty walls had been raised and its burning legends written, than in lifting the rocks of granite higher than the clouds of heaven and veiling them with their various mantle of purple, flower, and shadowy pine. Thank you.
Should I stop, Chair?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Lovely. Thank you so much, Emma and Sarah, for such a beautiful and thoughtful and really gorgeously illustrated presentation. When I saw what you had chosen as the key text, I thought, well, of course, how perfect. As 478, it used photography, and Sarah, photography and you are forever connected in my mind. Used photography to connect Venice with the Guild and its museum in Sheffield. So wonderfully well chosen. And then as you began, that sense of sort of connections across space and our shared humanity was so touchingly and strikingly brought to the fore as Emma opened by reminding us of Ruskin's European vision and his horror of unfolding war in Europe. And then Sarah later reminding us that Venice was the first city to experience aerial bombardment, really connecting past and present in moments of tragedy in a very touching way. But there was hope too in what you offered, and joy in what you offered too. So thank you very much. We have time for just a couple of questions or comments. I don't know whether anything has come into the chat function yet.
No, it hasn't.
No.
Oh, yes.
So if anybody would like to speak, either putting it in the chat function or if you can do a hands up function, that's also quite useful. Or indeed initially just unmuting and speaking. I see a comment from Kathleen. Did you want to say anything, Kathleen, or Michelle? Or are you happy?
No, it's fine. I think my written comment captures it. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm keeping my screen off. I'm in a shared space and there's some noise and I have my mask on. So
okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right.
Again, I'm just skimming across.
Okay.
And I'm also looking in part, just hoping that Peter Berman has managed to make it in the end, but it doesn't look like he has. He was traveling to Venice today, for those of you who know Peter.
He was on his way. Right.
So if there aren't any pressing comments or questions, I know Sarah and Emma would happily take emails later if anybody wanted to raise any. And again, yeah, lovely thanks coming in the message section. We're getting near enough to our cutoff time at 6:30 that I might begin to draw us to a close unless there's anything either of you would like to add, Emma or Sarah.
Nothing I can think of now, but thank you for the messages, everyone. Yes, and if anybody does want to ask any questions by email at a later date, of course, one be only too happy to respond or give more details about the various readings.
Good, in which case, can I ask you all to join me? I know it's difficult to do applause online, but join me to again thank Sarah Quill and Emma Sdegno for guiding us and taking us along their journey with Ruskin in Venice tonight. And I think we also need to say thanks to a few others. So all the previous speakers in this series, to Simon Seligman, the Guild's Membership and Communications Officer, who has looked after the operational aspects of these 4 monthly Friday evening readings, and to all of you who've been attending these sessions. And of course, to Peter Berman, who perceived the need to come together in a group to read Ruskin, chose the theme of Voices from Venice, and organized the series. And as Peter beautifully expressed it in an email recently, the mountain of Ruskin's writings is very tall, but much less daunting if we can climb it in good company, sharing our insights on the way. And so thank you, Sarah and Emma, for helping us work our way up that mountain. And finally, I want to close with a reminder that while this is the final session of monthly 1-hour directed readings, it is not the final Voices from Venice event. Peter Berman, the Guild's Director for International Relations, has organized a marvelous one-day conference composed of more than a dozen stellar voices. It will be held online on the 2nd of April, runs from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. UK time, but you can dip in and out. We're not expecting you to stay online all day because that's a long day. No charge for attending, but you must book via Eventbrite as you did tonight. Simon has put the link in the chat function, and you can find details on the Guild of St. George website as well. So I hope to see you all there. And with that, I will say good night and thank you.
Good night.